What's going on, everybody? Today I want to talk about the reality of fly rod length when comparing rods of similar weight or similar structure. What do you get by going with a longer fly rod or a shorter fly rod in certain circumstances? So you just went and bought a couple of fly rods, or maybe you have one, or maybe you're looking to buy a fly rod, and you've decided on a specific weight for your application. Great, but do you go with, for example, an 8.5 or a 9 foot, an 8 foot or an 8.5, 8 foot or 9 foot, or for example, with one weights here, do I go for a 7 foot or a 7.5, a 6.5, 6 foot? What do you get by going with a longer or shorter fly rod? Today I'm going to break down some of the things to consider when you're looking for fly rod length. So what might make you want to go with a shorter fly rod? Here I have a one weight. This is an Outlaw one weight that is 7 foot. It's made specifically for very small applications and blue lining, bushwhacking, you name it. But with shorter fly rods, you often get, if I were to buy this or a 7.5 foot, this will typically feel softer. It won't necessarily be softer, but it will feel softer, meaning it will load casts closer. It will feel more noodle-like, softer on tippet, and that's because the back end of the blank is going to be less thick and less dense, not less dense, but less strong of a butt section compared to by adding length to and tapering wider the fly rod. Additionally, your casting, therefore, when overlining, for example, on small streams, a rod like this will feel like it will cast closer, easier, and that is because the same amount of line, for example, the same line on this rod versus a longer rod will load the rod a little bit better at the same length out of the tip top, or you can get away with loading the rod with less line because there's less stiffness to the blank itself, if that makes sense. Additionally, these rods, because of there being less material, are typically lighter than the same rod in the equivalent length. That's kind of a longer length. It's kind of a no-brainer. That means that if it's lighter, you can carry it around maybe a little bit better throughout the day, or additionally, you have to use less reel to balance it out. The rod balances a little bit better on its swing weight forward. So, not saying balance is all that important realistically, but if I wanted to say I can have a 10.5 foot Euro nymphing rod versus a 2 weight of a similar blank in a 10 foot rod, typically the longer rod will require a little bit more of a reel, substantial reel, unless you move that weight center mass. So all things being equal, if I have two rods that have a regular uplocking reel seat and it's the same distance from the back, the one that's shorter will require less weight to balance it out. Okay. Now this maybe only applies for specific streamer applications, but a shorter rod does strip a little bit nicer and easier closer to the angler, allowing you more control of the rod tip, whereas a longer rod sometimes doesn't do as well. That's, for example, when it comes to bass rods, it's kind of nice sometimes to have a shorter rod. Those tapers, however, are more aggressive on those rods. But that also might mean that if you're fishing from the bank, that's nice, but from a boat, you want a longer rod to get closer to the water for your stripping application. It depends on what you're going to fish for, how you're going to fish, and what it is you're looking for as far as your swing weight goes. Now, why might you want a longer rod? Well, typically it allows you to mend easier, keep more line off the water, easier to present fly, line and tippet higher off the water. You can high stick a little bit better. The castability might be a little bit nicer. The load on learning to cast is a little bit nicer because of the leverage you have at longer distances. That also being said, fighting fish, there's a lot more backbone because you're adding material to the butt section of the rod, and therefore you have some backbone when you're fighting bigger fish. Landing fish, Sometimes it's more challenging with a long rod. Sometimes it might be easier if you have a long net. Depends on your situation. You have to be more mindful of breaking the rod, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it's a worse off application. It's just on the angler in that case. Also, like we were talking about, because if you go with a longer rod, like a 10 or 11 foot rod sometimes, you can get away with having a lighter rod weight and still have lots of sensitivity. The lighter, like if, for example, with Euro nymphing, you can use a 10.5 foot 2 weight and still fight pretty big fish because you've got a lot of backbone in the longer end of like a 10.5 or 11 foot rod. Or if you're fighting big game fish, a 9 to 10 foot rod sometimes allows you to go, for example, with steelhead, you can go with a 6 or a 7 weight 11 foot rod compared to a 7 or an 8 weight 9 foot rod. As you pare down the size of the rod, you can sometimes get away with a smaller reel because of that, allowing you to have a lighter setup, which again depends on how particular you want to get, but longer rods have a lot of great application, including being easier to cast and better to punch with leverage in the wind. All that being said, all that really matters is that you know what you want to fish for, what your applications are, and if you have any questions about what I would suggest, go ahead and leave them in the comments below. I'd love to help you out. Check out some of the links in the description with different sponsored content sometimes we have. But apart from that, this video is not sponsored. But I would gladly have, if given the chance, I would love to tell you which rods and applications I think I would go with if I were you. So go ahead and leave those below. Please give the video a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. Check out the apparel and all the fun stuff that I have going on. And hopefully this was informative. If it was, please again, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel. Catch you guys on the flip side. Tight lines, and we're out.